The morning light filtered softly through the faded curtains, barely touching the worn wooden table where I sat alone. My hands wrapped around a chipped cup of coffee, its warmth failing to chase away the cold that had taken residence inside me. The house seemed to hold its breath, every corner echoing the absence of him, my husband, my partner, gone yet present in every silent room. For decades, I had built a home from the fragments of our life together, quietly sacrificing parts of myself to ensure a future for our children. But now, in this stillness, I felt unseen. Days passed in a steady rhythm of quiet reflection. Early mornings were reserved for memories, the softness of his voice, the comforting weight of his hand in mine during restless nights. Yet today, those memories felt like distant echoes, offering no solace. A profound loneliness wrapped me tight, the silence pressing in with unbearable weight. I traced the cracks on my coffee cup, letting my mind wander back to the countless nights spent working tirelessly to secure a future for Alan and Maya. I thought of the love I had given freely, the silent sacrifices no one acknowledged, the tears swallowed in darkness to keep their lives stable. And now, those offerings seemed to vanish like mist, unnoticed and unreturned. Without him humming in the background, without the familiar scent of his tobacco lingering in the hallway, the house grew colder, more hollow. Even the photographs on the walls lost their warmth, smiles frozen in time, but hollow now. My children, once the center of my world, had become distant strangers. I wondered if they missed him at all, or if I had become nothing more than a burden. That afternoon, I found myself scrolling aimlessly through my phone, a device I barely used. My thumb froze on a notification, a post tagged with our family name. My heart clenched as I tapped it open, and the words on the screen shattered me like glass. Alan and Maya had announced my death, fabricating the news to justify a fundraiser. They claimed to honor my memory and raise money in my name, but beneath their words lay a selfish scheme. It was a performance designed to manipulate sympathy and fill their pockets. I dropped the phone onto the table, its screen glowing coldly in the dim kitchen. The silence around me grew deafening as outrage and humiliation collided inside my chest. How could the children I nurtured and loved so fiercely reduce me to a mere tool for greed? I was no longer their mother to respect, but a commodity to exploit. A wave of shame mixed with fury engulfed me. My cheeks burned with unshed tears, my chest tightened with disbelief. I felt invisible beneath their lies, discarded like refuse. But beneath the storm, a steely resolve began to form. This was no ordinary pain. It was a challenge, a betrayal demanding reckoning. I fled to my room, walls silently bearing witness to my turmoil. Outside, life carried on, indifferent to my suffering. Inside, I wrestled with shattered trust and broken memories. Every smile, every promise now seemed tainted by their deception. The realization settled in sharply. I was a stepping stone beneath their ambition, a forgotten sacrifice. The sweet memories turned bitter. I recalled rainy afternoons teaching Maya to bake, flour dusting her small hands, laughter spilling freely. Alan struggling over homework, frustrated until my voice reassured him he was enough. Those moments now felt like illusions, hiding their growing greed. The betrayal stung deepest because it was so honest in its cruelty. I had poured everything into their futures, sacrificing my peace for their dreams. Yet here I sat, discarded, manipulated, forgotten. The heavy burden awoke a quiet fire inside me, a fire of survival and dignity. I paced my room, feet soft on the worn carpet, grappling with a flood of emotions. Anger burned beneath every measured breath. Years of love repaid with deceit, replaced by empty gestures and hollow words. They had stolen my rightful place with their lies. As the afternoon slipped into bruised twilight, I sat still, letting silence cloak me like armor. I refused to shout or plead. My silence was my strength. They would hear my truth, but on my terms. In that quiet endurance, beneath grief and shame, the first spark of resolve flickered. I would no longer be a shadow in their story. I was Eleanor Parker, mother and survivor. My home was now a battleground where silence became my weapon and truth my shield. And so I sat, broken but unbowed, the mother who once sacrificed in silence, now preparing, quietly, for the reckoning that awaited. The silence I chose was not born from defeat, but from necessity, honed by years of experience. I had learned long ago that anger, when unleashed without clear purpose, is like smoke, visible for a moment, then dispersing into nothing. So instead, I wrapped myself in quiet observation, letting the pain settle beneath the surface, fueling a steady, deliberate fire. The house, once filled with noise and warmth, transformed into a sanctuary, a place where I could gather strength concealed from prying eyes. In the days that followed, memories flooded over me like tidewaters, washing through moments both bitter and sweet. I revisited the warmth of small hands grasping mine, the soft whispers of bedtime stories, the familiar scent of meals cooked with love. But alongside those tender recollections dwelt darker shadows, nights spent wiping away tears born of frustration or misunderstanding, moments when I swallowed my own pain to keep peace, sacrifices made in silence that had seemingly gone unnoticed. It was a complex tapestry, frayed by disappointments, yet held together by love. The more I reflected, the more the pattern revealed itself clearly. For years, my love had been a currency I spent without keeping count. Their affections were transactional, given only as long as I met their needs and expectations. When my husband was alive, he balanced the scales. His presence had tempered their entitlement. Now, in the absence of his steady hand and watchful eyes, their greed tipped the balance dangerously. I forced myself to confront uncomfortable truths I had long avoided. Our relationship, once warm and nurturing, had warped into a series of conditional exchanges. Alan's evasive answers about his sudden trips, the secretive tones he adopted when his phone buzzed, Maya's charming and manipulative messages to men I didn't know, all of it painted a picture I was reluctant to accept. Though I had sensed shadows before, I had been too tender-hearted to fully acknowledge them. Now the truth blazed inside me like a fierce, scorching flame, obliterating denial and exposing the cracks festering beneath the surface of our family. They had bartered their values and love for money and freedom, using false grief like a mask to hide their selfishness. Their betrayal was a harsh mirror, reflecting my own silent failures, the quiet surrender I had allowed in the name of motherhood and peace. Yet beneath the weight of that damning truth, a spark of clarity ignited, fueled by rage and resilience. I could no longer carry the burden of silence that protected their deception. It was time to reclaim my voice, my dignity, my life. My days became dedicated to quiet vigilance. I began cataloging every slight, every deception and excuse, committing each detail to memory and paper alike. I observed their habits from the shadows of my own home, the small but telling gestures of greed slipping through their carefully choreographed performances. Patience became my greatest weapon. While they carried on with their charades, I gathered evidence, overheard phone calls, suspicious texts, odd financial transactions, all fragments that slowly assembled into an undeniable mosaic. Nights grow long as I pored over bank statements, tax documents, and legal records. The numbers whispered a story of theft and betrayal, the slow siphoning away of the life savings I had fought so hard to protect. My husband's admonitions about vigilance, saving, and trusted documentation echoed sharply in my mind. The bitter irony was not lost on me. The warnings I had once ignored now became my armor. My mind, once thought to be fading with age, sharpened instead. I mapped out strategies and scenarios, carefully imagining a future confrontation, not one of rage and chaos, but one of controlled revelation and quiet power. I craved justice that was measured and redemptive, justice that mended wounds without destroying what little trust remained. Above all, I sought the restoration of my dignity. There were moments when despair clawed at me, when the lonely weight of betrayal seemed overwhelming and the road ahead impossibly long. But those moments were fleeting, crushed beneath a resolve forged by decades of endurance. One night, a flood of memories struck me. The sacrifices I made, the endless nights of worry, the patient labor to create a secure future, culminating in my husband's last words, spoken with gentle warning. Protect yourself. His voice, once faint and fragile, now became a fierce beacon guiding me through the darkness. Within that stillness, I rediscovered a love untouched by deceit. It was a mother's love, pure and unreserved, a love that would fuel me in reclaiming my worth and peace. Though the pain sat heavy in my chest, it felt manageable alongside that enduring flame. I kept my plans guarded and silent. The world saw a grieving widow wrapped in sorrow. My children, reckless in their entitlement, had no inkling that their mother was no longer the broken woman they presumed. During these long, quiet hours, I nurtured patience and a sharpened eye. I watched as they rehearsed their lies, weaving a web so delicately it fooled many. The fundraiser they plotted, a cruel masquerade, wrapped in false mourning, would be their greatest betrayal and, ultimately, their downfall. Day by day, I allowed the storm inside to build. It was a silent, measured fury, ready not to destroy, but to reclaim all that was mine. Each breath and thought prepared me for the moment when my silence would break, shattering their illusions. My silent decision was a vow. They would never see me broken again. I would expose their deceit with clarity and calm, dismantle their betrayal with unyielding precision. Enclosed in this cocoon of reflection and unspoken grief, I became a quiet storm, steady, powerful, and poised to strike with an unrelenting truth. The first step in my new fight was gathering proof, tangible, irrefutable evidence that could not be dismissed or distorted by emotion or cunning words. I had spent years hiding pain to keep peace, but I now knew that peace built on silence was fragile and dangerous. The truth needed to be unearthed and wielded with precision, not smothered beneath innocence or maternal indulgence. I plunged into the archives of my life, unearthing stacks of financial records, bank statements, and tax papers tucked away in old drawers and forgotten folders. Each document I examined pulled together a narrative I hadn't wanted to see. Beneath familiar names and dates were irregular transactions and hidden withdrawals. Money shifted furtively, as if to avoid detection. It was a tide of betrayal, steady and cold, sucking away years of hard work and sacrifice. The magnitude of their theft chilled me to my core. Yet, the money trail alone wasn't enough. I had to decipher the ways my children had masked their deceit, the subtle gestures, the coded language, their whispered conversations far from my ears. I began listening with new vigilance, intercepting phone calls when possible, noting elusive text messages, and observing interactions through windows and whispered meetings. Alan, my once boyish son, had morphed into a man I hardly recognized, his charm now weaponized, sharp and practiced like a blade. Maya's manipulation felt almost effortless, a toxic mix of sweetness and calculated intent. I saw them glance at one another furtively, switching between playful ruses and cold strategies. Their casual strategy was chilling, revealing that they cared little for me or the history we shared. Our once warm home now felt like a silent war zone. I moved through rooms where echoes of laughter were exchanged for quiet calculations. I became a tactician, piecing together behaviors and motives into a clear picture. The stakes were no longer abstract. They were about reclaiming my life, dignity, and the future my husband and I had built. Patience, an attribute I had prized as a quiet strength, became my greatest weapon. While my children continued their careless scheming, I bided my time, gathering information carefully, studying their routines, the people they trusted to keep their web intact. Their overconfidence was a window to their downfall. One bleak evening, rain tapping a morose rhythm against the window panes, I uncovered the cruelest revelation: the fundraiser. They had crafted a spectacle around my faked death, exploiting sympathy to extract money from unsuspecting friends and relatives. The depth of their callousness struck me harder than any blow. Their greed was uninhibited, their betrayal complete. Yet in the midst of hurt, clarity emerged. This was the battleground where I would make my stand. Knowing that raw anger would be a fragile ally, I reached out to someone I trusted, Joanna, an old friend and lawyer. Her voice on the phone was calm and firm, infused with the kind of steady assurance I desperately needed. I recounted my findings, not as a broken victim, but as an informed strategist. Joanna listened keenly, then shifted gears, discussing legal avenues, uncharted paths for justice, and restitution. Our meetings became my lifeline. In her book-lined office, scented with leather and quiet authority, I handed over documents, photographs, and digital evidence that mapped the architecture of deceit. Joanna didn't coddle me with false hope. Instead, she laid out precise plans of action, options that felt both daunting and promising. It was a plan to uproot the deceit at its foundation. With Joanna's guidance, my confidence grew. The lonely fight transformed into a gathering of strength. While my children reveled in their illusions of control, I was assembling an arsenal they could never anticipate. Intercepting their stolen moments uncovered more than cold schemes. I heard Maya's biting sarcasm as she discussed keeping the performance flawless, heard Alan's anxious bravado thinly cloaking fear. This wasn't just about money. It was about silencing me forever. Their laughter, light and careless, held the hollow ring of cruelty. Their arrogance was their Achilles' heel. They believed themselves untouchable, but they had grossly underestimated the old woman they had relegated to the sidelines. Every detail went onto plans Joanna and I crafted: financial paper trails, proving fraud and misappropriation, recorded conversations illuminating manipulation, legal channels to ensure their lies would unravel before the eyes of the world. We plotted to expose not just financial crimes, but the moral betrayal, a reckoning to reclaim more than money, but my dignity and voice. Amid these preparations, I nurtured emotional clarity. Each flashback, each wound reopened was tempered by resolve. I welcomed the pain, but kept bitterness at bay. This battle demanded balance. Rage struck from reason, not passion driven only by hurt. My husband's study became my war room. The lingering scent of his favorite cologne mingled with the rustle of papers and steady ticking of his old clock. I imagined his unwavering presence beside me, steady and silent, encouragement beyond words. I rehearsed confrontations in solitude, poised and measured, the embodiment of control. This calm was the armor I would wear in public, the opposite of the broken, grief-stricken figure my children expected. The transformation was profound. No longer the silent sufferer, I was an architect of justice, a woman determined to retrieve every stolen fragment of her life. My mission was beyond money. It was about reclaiming trust, home, and identity. Pain and conflict lay ahead, but so did hope, the promise that truth would restore what lies had destroyed. Each day the evidence mounted. Every clue sharpened the blade I was preparing to wield. They believed they had buried me beneath their lies, but I was ready to rise, unbroken, unrelenting. The stage was set. The reckoning was imminent, and I was prepared. The day of the fundraiser dawned cold and silent, the kind of morning that presses weight against your chest and demands every ounce of strength you can muster. I rose before the sun, breathing carefully to steady the storm churning inside me. This was no ordinary gathering. It was the agonizing stage set by my children's greed, a cruel masquerade to manipulate the affection of those who didn't know the truth. But I was ready. Months of quiet planning and meticulous preparation had taught me how to wield patience like armor, how to turn silence into a weapon more powerful than any angry outburst. My hands moved with purpose as I dressed, a simple, modest outfit that reflected the dignity I intended to reclaim. The mirror showed a woman transformed, no longer fragile or broken, but steady and resolute. The faint creases etched by years of sorrow and endurance, or matched by an unyielding glance beneath steady eyes. I wasn't the grieving widow my children hoped the world would see. I was the mother standing strong beneath their lies. Before leaving, I gathered the heavy evidence, carefully packed and organized, thin folders of bank statements marking vanished sums, printed texts and emails capturing moments of deceit, and a small encrypted device carrying intercepted conversations that spoke louder than any accusation I could make. These weren't just papers. They were the threads that would unravel the web my children had spun around my life and the seeds of justice I would plant in its place. Joanna arrived quietly, a steady presence wrapped in a calm born of knowledge. No words were wasted between us. We had rehearsed this enough. She shared a look that told me her confidence was the reflection of my own resolve. The legal team was ready, discreetly positioned, silent guardians awaiting the moment when truth would rise from the shadows. As we approached the venue, the scene was surreal. Rows of chairs filled with faces expectant of mourning. The floral arrangements, the somber music, the tributes, all masking the theft that had been plotted beneath this well-crafted facade. I could see Alan and Maya moving through the crowd with the practiced ease of actors well-rehearsed, their smiles brittle, their grief a calculated display designed to manipulate the sympathy of strangers. Watching them was like staring at ghosts masquerading in flesh, those two driven by the relentless hunger for money and control, willing to sacrifice anything, even the truth of their own mother, for their gain. Their eyes flickered nervously at moments, scanning for vulnerability, but they had no inkling of the storm about to break over their carefully constructed stage. The discreet presence of my lawyer and the quietly summoned authorities added a tension to the air, unseen to most but palpable to those paying careful attention. I felt the fine line between calm and chaos stretch thin as the event unfolded. The room echoed with stories and tears, gifts given in my memory, and eulogies that stitched false grief into a convincing tapestry. And then I stepped forward. Not with fury or cries, but with the measured calm of truth reclaimed. The gasp that rippled through the crowd was preceded only by the clicking of cameras and the rustling of whispered disbelief. My presence shattered the illusion. I was very much alive, standing before those who had tried to erase me. With a subtle nod to Joanna, who stood by my side like a sentinel, the police moved decisively. Alan and Maya's expressions drained of color. Their performance faltered, replaced by shock and scrambling fear. The auditorium transformed suddenly from a stage of pretense to a courtroom of reckoning. I spoke then, my voice clear and steady, telling the crowd the truth they needed to hear. No anger, no pleading, just fact and dignity. The children's lies, their manipulation, their betrayal were exposed to the watchful eyes of witnesses, both familiar and new. I reminded all present that the woman they mourned was standing in front of them, demanding accountability. The room vibrated with disbelief, sympathy dissolving into scrutiny. Eyes that had so freely given pity now sought answers. The carefully built house of cards collapsed under the weight of evidence and presence. My children, once so certain of control, found themselves powerless before the truth. They tried to weave tales, excuses faltered on lips grown dry, but the truth was a blade sharper than their words, unyielding and precise. The evidence, the recorded conversations, the financial documents, all laid bare the cold reality that could not be undone. I remained composed, a silent pillar amidst the chaos. There were no tears, no wails. Those had long since been shed in the quiet nights of preparation. Instead, there was only the unshakable resolve forged over years of neglect and deception. I reclaimed my story and my dignity with every breath. As the authorities began their work, questionings and document retrieval, I watched the tide of horror and reluctant regret fill the eyes of my children. Their betrayal was no longer hidden in shadow, but illuminated in bright daylight for all to see. The price of their greed was now going to be paid. The crowd dispersed gradually, some with tears of shock, others whispered in stunned sympathy. Many offered quiet nods of support, while some held the weight of confusion and disbelief. But the mask was shattered, and I walked among the remnants of their facade with a quiet triumph. Leaving the venue, the night air wrapped around me like a cleansing balm. A burden lifted, replaced by a profound sense of empowerment. The silence I had worn as armor was now a symphony of reclaimed strength. My voice, once drowned beneath betrayal, had risen to reclaim dignity and demand justice. The road ahead would still be fraught with struggle. Courtrooms awaited, conversations with estranged family would be inevitable, and healing would demand time. But this moment was a beacon, a starting point where truth had begun to unravel years of deception. For the first time in many years, I felt a sense of peace threading through the turmoil. The silence had shifted, from a shield hiding pain to a herald of justice and liberation. The house that once felt like a prison was reborn as a place of new beginnings. As I closed the door behind me that night, the heaviness in my chest had tamed into a steady, graceful strength. The battle was far from over, but I had taken the critical step. The reckoning I had long awaited was no longer distant. It was here. And I was ready. The echoes of that day lingered long after the crowd dispersed and the venue emptied. I felt an unusual calm settle over me, a clarity born of revelation and confrontation. The betrayal that had loomed like an oppressive shadow was no longer concealed. My children's faces, once confident and calculated, had crumbled beneath the weight of exposure. Their lies, meticulously crafted and rehearsed, dissolved into desperate fragments, naked before the gaze of justice and truth. Standing amid the turmoil, I found myself caught between distant memories and harsh present realities. The truth I had so carefully gathered now lay bare for all to see. But with it came the complex emotions of a fractured family unraveling in public view. I watched the eyes of former friends and relatives shift, some filled with shock, others with pity, and a few with quiet judgment. It was a chorus of voices I could no longer silence, and I realized that this was only the beginning of a larger reckoning. The hardest moments weren't the ones when the authorities led my children out of the hall or when murmurs turned toward speculation and gossip. No, the hardest moments were the silent ones inside me, the flickers of grief for what had once been, the remnants of hope I desperately clung to, and the aching knowledge that the family I had devoted my life to was fracturing beyond repair. Yet, beneath the sorrow, a new strength was crystallizing. I recognized that this was the moment when I could reclaim not just my assets or legal rights, but my identity, the core of who I was beyond the roles they had forced upon me. I was not merely a violated mother or a victim of greed. I was a woman empowered by the quiet resolution to live her truth openly and unreservedly. Days stretched into weeks filled with legal battles and difficult conversations that tested my resolve. Joanna, ever faithful, stood by me as we navigated the complex and tedious dance of paperwork, court appearances, and negotiations. Each encounter demanded patience, fortitude, and an unwavering commitment to the truth, no matter the personal cost. My children, once so sure of their dominion, now found themselves cornered by evidence and law. Alan's defiant gaze flickered with uncertainty in the courtroom, while Maya's earlier charm gave way to frustrated tears. It was painful to witness, but more painful to acknowledge the depth of their betrayal's consequences. Family gatherings became minefields of tension and unspoken resentment. Some relatives chose sides, while others withdrew into silence, unsure how to reconcile the stark truths with the memories they cherished. I found solace in the rare moments of genuine connection, the quiet support of those who understood the human complexity underlying the conflict. Amid this turbulence, the home that had once felt like a prison slowly transformed. The walls, once filled with shadows of mistrust, began to breathe again with cautious hope. I restored spaces for quiet reflection, reclaimed rooms where memories, though tinged with pain, were now reminders of endurance and renewal rather than betrayal. Each morning, as the sunlight filtered through the curtains, I would sit quietly with a cup of tea, reminding myself that healing was a journey measured not by speed but by intention. I learned to embrace moments of solitude without loneliness, moments of sadness without surrender, and moments of silence as spaces where strength took root. Financial restitution was only part of the victory. More profound was the reclaiming of autonomy, the ability to decide who belonged in my life, what stories I told about myself, and how I chose to move forward beyond the shadows of deceit. I found unexpected empowerment in small acts, sorting old photographs removed from clutter by years of neglect, planting flowers in the garden once left to overgrow. Even cooking meals that once felt like labor, but now became acts of joy and care for myself. These gestures were quiet affirmations of life reclaimed. The legal resolutions began to take shape, with courts recognizing the fraud and enforcing measures to prevent further exploitation. Yet, no verdict or sentence could erase the emotional scars or mend the fragile ties severed by deception. It was a reminder that justice was as much about the heart as it was about law. Importantly, the experience reshaped how I viewed love and family. The unconditional love I had yearned for but seldom received from my children was now replaced by a more profound understanding of boundaries and self-respect. I embraced the painful truth that sometimes loving oneself meant letting go of those who choose betrayal over connection. In those moments of reflection, I often thought of my husband, his quiet strength, his lessons of resilience. I felt his presence not as a haunting absence, but as a guiding force pushing me towards peace and self-realization. I carried forward the legacy of unwavering love he instilled in me, now turned inward and fortified. The journey toward wholeness was neither linear nor painless. There were setbacks, days when grief threatened to overwhelm, times when old doubts crept in unbidden. Yet, in the overarching narrative, I held fast to the knowledge that liberation awaited on the other side of endurance. As time passed, I began to envision a future unshackled from past betrayals, a future where silence was no longer a shield but a space for honest dialogue and healing. I dreamed of opening my home not as a place marked by conflict, but as a refuge for hope, reclaimed trust, and rekindled life lessons. And above all, I understood that empowerment was born not only from victory over others, but through the courageous act of choosing peace within myself, a peace hard won, deeply felt, and fiercely protected. The storm was behind me, but its lessons remained etched in my heart, teaching me that true strength is found not in silence alone, but in the fierce, quiet resolve to live authentically, to love wisely, and to move forward with grace and courage. I had taken back my story. I had reclaimed my dignity. I was no longer a shadow in anyone's tale, but the author of my own, writing each new page with clarity, hope, and unwavering truth. In the quiet moments that followed, when the noise of confrontation and courtroom battles faded to distant echoes, I found myself standing on the edge of a new life, a life carved from pain but shaped by hope. The house around me, once heavy with silence and shadows, began to breathe again. Walls that had witnessed whispered lies and quiet suffering now held space for healing and renewal. Each day, I moved carefully through these rooms, tracing the memories woven into every corner, the laughter shared, the tears shed, the love both given and denied. These ordinary acts of living, folding clothes, arranging photographs, watering the plants on the windowsill, became rituals of reclamation. In tending to the tangible pieces of my life, I was quietly stitching together a future sewn from strength and grace. Outside, the garden, long neglected and overgrown, called to me like a waiting friend. As I cleared the weeds and planted new blooms, I felt the slow unfurling of my own growth mirrored in the earth. Each flower was a small victory, a tender declaration that life could bloom again even after long winters. The soil crumbled between my fingers like the doubts I once held close, now giving way to fertile ground for hope. Solitude, once a refuge born of necessity, became a cherished companion. I learned to embrace the stillness, with its echoes of both sorrow and wisdom, as a sacred space where my spirit could breathe freely. In silence, I found clarity. In moments alone, I met strength. The pain remained, lingering like a distant hum, but it no longer ruled me. Instead, it taught me resilience and patience. The fractures in my family could not be undone, but they began to be understood in the light of new boundaries. I came to see that love, to be true and nurturing, must be mutual. I mourned the absence of the unconditional love I had once yearned for from my children, but I honored the truth that embracing self-respect sometimes meant letting go of those who choose betrayal over connection. In the quiet hours of reflection, my thoughts often drifted to my husband, the steady presence who had anchored me through so many storms. His lessons of quiet strength and unwavering love were no longer just echoes of the past, but pillars holding me upright. I felt his spirit beside me, guiding me gently toward peace and self-realization. The legacy we built together had become my compass, pointing toward a life reclaimed. The path toward wholeness was neither smooth nor swift. There were days when grief swept over me in sudden waves, threatening to pull me under. Times when shadows of doubt crept back into my heart, whispering fears I thought vanquished. But through these trials, I held fast to the belief that liberation lived beyond endurance, that healing was a journey I was determined to complete. With time, the future I envisioned gradually came into focus. It was a future unbound by past betrayals, where silence was no longer a shield but a space for honest dialogue and authentic connection. I dreamed of opening my home not as a fortress warding off pain, but as a sanctuary welcoming hope, reclaimed trust, and renewed life lessons. More than anything, I realized that true empowerment blossoms not solely from triumph over others, but from the courageous choice to make peace within oneself. That peace, fragile and fierce, was a treasure gained through hardship and guarded fiercely. It transformed the silence that once sheltered me into a vibrant symphony of strength. Though the storm that had shaken my world had passed, its lessons remained etched deeply into my soul. They taught me that strength is not simply the absence of fear or pain, but the quiet, steady determination to live authentically, love wisely, and carry oneself with grace and courage. I had taken back my story, not as a victim living in the shadows, but as the author of my own life, penning each page with clarity, hope, and unwavering truth. The chapters ahead were mine to write, filled with promise and the resilient light that only comes from having survived the darkest nights.